a little bit about Grow and Lead. So, we are a nonprofit organization that helps communities across the Upper Peninsula be a great place for kids to grow up. We focus on fostering a culture that builds on the strengths of our young people to be sustainable communities, and we believe that the nonprofit sector is the best way to achieve this mission. So, we provide um, all kinds of consulting, technical assistance, and trainings like tonight's session. So, speaking of tonight's session, I would like to welcome Linda Remsburg. She will be tonight's presenter. And as a reminder, she will be taking questions at the end of the session. So, you're welcome to type them into the questions pane or chat box, and she will be answering them at the end. So, Linda, welcome.
Thank you very much, Victoria, and good evening, everyone. Sorry about that little mix-up there at the beginning. I just clicked on the wrong PowerPoint I had open, but we're all set to go now. I see we have some people here who are back with us from the first of our 3 webinars in the series on growing effective volunteer programs. And I see some new names too. Whichever of those groups you're in, I'm very glad you're here. There's a tremendous amount of material that can be covered around volunteer engagement. And I've tried to gear the series towards smaller nonprofits who rely a lot on volunteers. That's the demographic of nonprofits that are most common in the UP. I'll be covering the material at a fairly basic level, but whether you're from a large organization or a small one, with many volunteers or just a few, and whether you're starting to build your volunteer base or you've been working with volunteers for years, I hope you'll learn some strategies and maybe shift some thinking that will help you strengthen how you work with volunteers. By the end of the series, we'll have touched on the basics of what you need to build and sustain a solid volunteer program. As Victoria mentioned, we're recording these webinars, and in case you haven't heard the first webinar in the series, we'll include a link to that in a follow-up email that we send out tomorrow. If you weren't able to attend that first session, which was on volunteer recruitment, I encourage you to listen to that recording. Much of what we cover tonight builds upon what we learned in that first session. Tonight, we're talking about finding the right volunteer fit for volunteers in your organization. We'll do a quick review of some of what we covered regarding recruitment in our last session, and then move into best practices in volunteer screening and placement that will help ensure you get the right volunteer in the right position. And from there, we'll move into best practices in orientation and training, which help ensure the volunteers are comfortable and prepared with the right knowledge and skills to settle in and do the job. Here's a message that bears repeating. Volunteer engagement is a partnership. The most sustainable partnerships, of course, are where there's mutual benefit for both parties. It's important to think of volunteers in terms of helping them to partner with your organization to do what's important for the organization and what's important to them. That's how you'll be able to retain volunteers and sustain your volunteer program. This illustration will look familiar to those of you that were with us in that first webinar. It shows the elements that go into building a volunteer program. The volunteer engagement cycle, as it's often referred to, begins at the top with needs assessment and moves clockwise. Having best practices in place for each of these elements leads to higher volunteer retention, or in other words, volunteers will be more likely to continue volunteering with you, which is going to make your job that much easier. In the first webinar, we talked about the first 2 elements in the cycle, assessing your organization's needs and recruitment of volunteers. Tonight, we're going to cover the next two pairs of elements, screening and placement and orientation and training. Then in the final webinar, we'll cover supervision and recognition. Volunteer engagement's a continuous process that requires ongoing attention to each of these elements, including reassessing your organization's needs and the needs of your volunteers. The cycle never ends because the needs of your organization, as well as the needs of your volunteers, will continue changing. By the end of the series, you should have a pretty solid understanding of the basics that go into each of these elements, and you'll be able to put together a plan for engaging volunteers in your organization or for strengthening how you work with them in your organization. All right, let's get into it. Screening and placement. There are a number of tools that will help ensure that you get the right volunteer in the right position. And the trick is using the tools to be thorough enough to find out the knowledge, skills, and interests of a volunteer while not overwhelming or burdening them with lengthy processes or excessive paperwork. So here's what you need in your screening and placement toolbox. You need position descriptions, targeted recruiting, a volunteer application, interview, and background checks. And we'll take a look at each of these individually. First, position descriptions. Screening and placement starts with crafting well thought out position descriptions. These are the important written descriptions of what you want volunteers to do. They outline the responsibilities, qualifications, benefits, and expectations of the volunteer position. We talked about these in terms of recruitment during the last webinar, but they're also very important. They're an important way that volunteers can self-screen to see if a position fits with their interests and skills. And you can see the list of all that should be included in your position descriptions. And we'll attach a sample position description in the email that we send out to everyone tomorrow. It'll be the same one that we sent out following the first webinar. In that first webinar, we also talked about targeted recruitment, which is another step toward finding the right volunteer fit. And that's targeting your recruitment efforts toward a population that you have reason to believe would be especially open to volunteering with your organization and the positions you need to fill. It's about focusing your efforts more strategically on populations where there stands to be a high benefit for the volunteers and the organization. For example, an environmental organization needing volunteers to identify and remove invasive plant species might target students in the local university's botany or environmental science department. The students would likely have a higher level of interest in plants than the general population, and they'd likely be interested in the work to gain experience for potential future employment in the field. So that's an example of targeted recruiting. For long-term or highly skilled volunteer positions, you're going to need to use a volunteer application. And this is much like an employee application. It's to gather basic background information you need in order to connect with the volunteer and to discern whether they meet the basic requirements for volunteering with you. You want to ask about a volunteer's interests, skills, and availability. It should also include their contact information, things like prior volunteer experience, and depending on the position, you may want to ask for references. You might use one basic application for all volunteers, or you can modify an application for different positions. For one-time or episodic volunteers, such as for an event, You may not need anything more than the basic contact information, or you may just need information from the group leader. For instance, if it's like with a group, let's say a school or a church group. Depending on your organization, the number of volunteer positions, etc., an application can be posted online or in person, or have it in person at your organizations. These days, it's pretty common to have them available online for convenience. The next tool to pull out of our box is the volunteer interview. If a volunteer's application looked good, it's important to follow it up with an in-person interview, and to do that as soon as possible. The more lag you have between the time a volunteer expresses interest and when you actually get them in the door to volunteer, the more likely you are to lose them along the way. I also wanted to say too, I don't think I mentioned this, but the volunteer application will send out a sample of an application for you in that follow-up email tomorrow too. So, but back to the interview. An interview is an opportunity for you to learn more about a volunteer's skills and interests, and also to learn about their knowledge, their motivations, and their expectations. There are lots of different questions you can ask, of course, during an interview. Just remember to keep it more conversational than interrogative. A topic I think is particularly helpful to bring up is how they like to be recognized. Recognition of volunteer efforts is very important and needs to be tailored to the individual. So it's nice to get some idea right up front what they would welcome and what might be a turnoff for them. For example, some people like public recognition, and others are stressed out by it. Similarly, you might ask about their preference for working on their own or with others. The interview is also an opportunity for the volunteer to find out about the organization, its programs, open positions, and expectations. So include background information and be sure to give them the opportunity to ask questions too. Really look at the interview as a two-way conversation and plan to do as much listening as talking. That's an important step in developing a partnership with the volunteer. It's an opportunity to set a positive tone and a foundation of mutual respect and mutual benefit. It's a time to help them understand how their service will have an impact on the mission of the organization, or in other words, the difference their service will be making in the world. The interview is also a time that you might want to negotiate the position description. Those position descriptions don't need to be written in stone, which was a question that came up in that first webinar. It's really good to stay flexible with them. In talking with the volunteer, you might find they have super duper skills and interest, but their availability doesn't match with how you were envisioning structuring the job, or maybe they'd be fantastic doing parts of two different positions. It's okay to modify a position to best meet the needs of the volunteer. Just be sure that it still meets the needs of the organization. But overall, flexibility is a virtue, especially in today's volunteer environment. People are busier than ever, and to engage volunteers, you really need to do what's best for both parties. So don't try to fit a square peg into a round hole. Do what you can to accommodate the volunteers' needs, but still accomplish what the organization needs. Okay, so let's say you've had the interview, it went well, and you're very interested in bringing a volunteer aboard. There's still some due diligence to consider, and this would be a time to do some background checking, including references if you'd requested them. Depending on the position, and what you found out in the interview, you may want to conduct a more thorough background check. Factors to be considered in this are the client population, level of supervision, and level of risk with the volunteer position. If the volunteer is going to be working with a vulnerable population, such as children or the elderly, especially one-on-one, you probably you will want to do a criminal background check. I've listed a few here that are commonly used. The Internet Criminal History Access Tool, or ICHAT, operates through the Michigan State Police, and it's free for nonprofits. The Offender Tracking Information System, or OTIS, is an online service through the Michigan Department of Corrections, and it allows you to search by name for offenders or former offenders. And the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services Central Registry can provide information on child abuse and neglect offenders. For that one, there's a form to fill out, and you could get it online and take to your county DHHS office. If a volunteer is going to be handling money or financial information, you might be well served by running a credit and or a financial check. If they're going to be transporting people by motor vehicle, you might need a driving record check. As part of the interview process, you might consider asking volunteers to complete a background check permission form. It can be less awkward and more efficient to ask permission to do a background check rather than asking them directly about their arrest record. And if something does show up in a background check, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to dismiss them, but definitely be aware and consider it when placing them in a volunteer position. You may want to ask them directly about the offense at that point. For instance, a drunk driving conviction when someone was 18 might show up on a background check, but now they're 28 and they've successfully completed a sobriety court program and they've been sober for 10 years. You wouldn't know that unless you asked them for an explanation. You may still not want them transporting clients, but it doesn't mean that they can't volunteer in your organization in another capacity. And sometimes there just isn't a good fit for an individual within your organization for one reason or another, and you need to tell them no, and that's okay. Just be honest and brief, and be sure to document your reasons and keep it on file. So that's our screening and volunteer toolbox. As we close the lid and before we move on to orientation, I'm going to take a very brief break here for a drink of water. So Victoria, would you like to say a few words about questions while I do that?
Yes, I just wanted to remind everyone that the questions pane and chat windows are both open. So if there is anything that came up during Linda's first toolbox that you'd like to ask, feel free to type it in, and I will be reading those to Linda at the end of the webinar. A reminder, as Linda said, it is being recorded and you will get a copy of the slides tomorrow after we get it uploaded to YouTube. So, quick summary, type in your questions pane or chat box, and watch for the recording and slides in your inbox tomorrow. Back to you, Linda.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can. Okay, good. All right, let's move on to the next pair of elements in the volunteer engagement cycle, which are orientation and training. Orientation's a process of making volunteers feel comfortable with and understand the workings of the organization, and to let them understand how they can contribute to the purpose of the organization. All volunteers, whether they're serving at a one-time event or in an ongoing position, deserve some form of orientation. Few people appreciate being thrown into a situation unprepared, and orientation is the process for preparing them. The type and extent of orientation will differ for one-time or long-term volunteers, but the basic components are pretty much the same for both. Orientation is actually quite an exciting time for volunteers. They're almost always eager to learn about an organization, and they're anticipating putting their skills to work. And I think above all, they're eager to help and make a difference. It's exciting to be forming a new partnership, but as exciting as it is, orientation in the first few months of volunteering is also a somewhat fragile stage. If volunteers don't understand the goals of the organization or how their service fits with the overall mission, you risk losing them. But there are lots of ways to conduct orientation that will help keep them coming back. And we'll look at the different forms orientation can take. But first, let's look at 3 questions that a solid orientation needs to answer. In a nutshell, orientation should answer these questions for a volunteer. Number 1, why should I volunteer here? Number 2, how will I be volunteering here? Number 3, where do I fit in? So let's take each of these questions separately. So number 1, why should I volunteer here? Answering this question introduces volunteers to the purpose and the mission of the organization. You need to help them understand the mission, vision, and values of the organization. Now, you've already done some of that in the interview process, and in some cases that may be enough. In others, you'll need to cover it more in depth. Volunteers also need to have some understanding of the population served, the history of the organization, partners, and perhaps most importantly, its programs and services. Question number 2, how will I be volunteering here? The answer to this lies in introducing the volunteers to your organization's structure and systems and showing how their positions fit into the organization. It includes introducing them to policies and procedures, facilities and equipment, record keeping and reporting requirements that are relevant to their positions. And I emphasize relevant to their position. They don't need to know every policy or procedure of the organization, just enough so they can do their job and understand how it fits with the organization. And they also need to know of any requirements, for instance, around reporting their volunteer hours and any benefits that come with volunteering with the organization. Third, they need to know where they fit into the scheme of things. The answer to this question is more about the social aspects of the organization and introducing them to the community they're being asked to join. It includes acquainting them with the people in the organization, the chain of command, the organization's culture, etiquette, and opportunities to socialize. Developing social connections, by the way, is often a pretty strong motivator for people to volunteer. So those are the 3 questions that orientation needs to answer. It's a lot of information for a new volunteer to take in and process, and it's a lot for the organization to deliver. So it makes sense to have all that information in one central location where volunteers can access it and refer back to it. and that place would be a volunteer handbook. Every organization that engages volunteers should have some sort of a volunteer handbook. It's not only a good orientation tool, but it's also a valuable tool to maintain clear expectations throughout a volunteer's entire time with your organization. As situations arise where you and volunteers need to refer to a policy or procedure, they should be very easy to find in the handbook. So how do you create that book? Well, if you take each of the bullet points that we just covered under those orientation questions and write a line or two or maybe a paragraph, you'll have most of what you need for a handbook. Be sure to include important policies and procedures and try to state those as clearly as possible. Or you may have links to the policy and procedures if your handbook is online. It depends on if you're an organization that has many policies and procedures or just a few. At any rate, keep the tone of the whole document as conversational and welcoming as possible. Including a welcome letter from the director of the organization can help in that regard. Also, be sure to include a table of contents to make it easy to navigate. You may also want to include a page at the end with a volunteer agreement. In the agreement, emphasize the volunteer status of their service with the organization. Make sure that it's clear that there will be no compensation provided and that they're volunteering of their own free will. This is just sort of that's part of risk management. And you might want to add a line that states that they've read and understand the handbook and agree to abide by the policies and procedures included in it. And of course, have them sign and date it. Then give them a copy and keep a copy on file. One of our Grow and Lead member organizations, the Brick Ministries, has a very well put together handbook that they have graciously agreed to let us share with you all as an example. So we'll attach that in the follow-up email as well. They really do a nice job. Volunteer handbooks can be printed and given to each volunteer in an organization, or you may email it to the volunteers so they can print it themselves if they want, or include it as a PDF on your website. Any of those ways. But of course, orientation is much more than just handing your volunteers a copy of the volunteer handbook. The handbook is just one piece of orientation. We know that volunteer engagement is a partnership, and partnerships are relationships built on trust, communication, and understanding. And those qualities need to be introduced and nurtured through more interaction than just simply reading a document provides. So we'll talk about ways to conduct orientation. There are a number of different ways you can do this. The trick is to find what works best in your unique situation. As with most parts of volunteer engagement, the most effective method will be determined, at least in part, by how many volunteers you engage and in what positions. You might find that what works best is a combination of ways to deliver different pieces of your orientation. Keep in mind, the more personal the orientation is, the more opportunity you have to build a relationship with the volunteers, which of course is important. And some pieces of orientation are best done in person. For instance, showing volunteers around the environment they're going to be working in and introducing them to staff and clients. Those are great opportunities to help the volunteers feel welcome and comfortable. Group orientation sessions are likely the way to go if you have a number of volunteers coming into the organization at once. This way, everyone hears the same information at the same time and in the same way. It also saves time for you rather than having to repeat the material multiple times. Some organizations like to offer new volunteer orientation just a few times spread over the year. Keep in mind, if you do only offer it a few times, you may miss volunteers who aren't available on those days or at those times. And also keep in mind that the longer the session runs, the less likely volunteers are going to be able to commit to it. So if they know going in that it's going to be a 3 or 4 hour session, yeah, you might not get everybody there. But sometimes still the group sessions are the best way to go. If volunteers are going to be working together, for instance, this is a great time to help them get to know each other by including team building and socializing activities. If you only engage a few volunteers a year and they're in different positions, it might make more sense to schedule orientation time with each individual as they come into the organization. And some orientation can be done online. Volunteers are typically very busy and you need to make it as easy and efficient as possible for them. And that can mean using technology when and where it makes sense. It might start with posting all or parts of your volunteer handbook online, but you can also consider more interactive online ways to help them acquire and process the knowledge they need to do the job, because that's the part of orientation that can be done online, that acquiring and processing knowledge. And I'll talk more about using technology in a few minutes, so hold that thought. In addition to providing volunteers with knowledge, your orientation may also need to include helping volunteers develop certain skills to do the job. And this leads into the final topic we're going to touch on tonight, which is training. Volunteer training is the process of providing volunteers with the knowledge and skills they need to effectively perform specific roles and duties. This applies to both new volunteers in their orientation training and also to volunteers that have been with you a long time and who need additional knowledge and or skills for the job. When you're determining whether volunteers need training, think about the knowledge and skills they need to do the job but don't yet have, because that's really what training can provide. If they already have the skills and knowledge, but there are issues, say, with motivation or attitude or the work environment or communication, those aren't likely to be impacted by training. Those will be better addressed through ongoing supervision, which is what we're going to cover in the next webinar. So be sure to join us for that. As I mentioned a couple slides back, some training, specifically training that provides knowledge, can be done online, and it's definitely worth considering. This can be a significant time saver for you, for the organization, and also a major convenience for the volunteers. Training videos, for instance, say on YouTube, are one option. Webinar platforms such as we're using tonight, right now, are another option. We use GoToWebinar. Zoom is another low-cost platform. If you do use online training, you might consider building in a survey or a quiz to assess whether the volunteer completed the training and how well they've learned the material. SurveyMonkey is one online platform you can use for that. Typeform and ClassMarker are a couple of available quiz creation platforms. Quizzes can really help with reinforcing learning too. If a volunteer gets an answer wrong, follow it up with an explanation of the correct answer or remind them of where to go to find the answer. I've had trainings with those sorts of quizzes before, and it's really really been valuable to me to see, like, oh, that's what the right answer is, or like I said, where you go to find it. Even with all the options for online learning, some learning is still best achieved through in-person training, such as job shadowing or pairing a volunteer with staff who can demonstrate or teach a skill. Just be sure to build in sufficient time for the volunteer to practice the skills. You can also use case studies or hypothetical scenarios to generate discussion that leads to learning. So all of these training methods, whether they're online or in person, can be used for both new volunteers and experienced volunteers. Even the most experienced volunteers, just like paid staff, will benefit from learning new skills or strengthening existing ones. And they may be most open to it if it's framed as professional development or continuing education rather than training. Promoting a culture of continuous learning and growth in your volunteers can be very motivating to them and will keep them coming back for more. Okay, well, geez, we've covered a lot of ground tonight. Let's go ahead and open it up for questions. If you have questions on anything we've covered, you can type them in the box now. And Victoria, do we have any questions that have shown up?
We don't have any questions yet. If you are typing a question, we can't tell. So hit that raise hand button on the side so that we can see one is coming through. If you would, that would be super helpful. And at this time, I'm not seeing any raised hands, Linda, so I don't know that anyone has questions tonight.
Okay, well, that's all right. Well, we've got a couple of slides here to finish up. Oops, there. Well, it's been a pleasure having you with us here tonight. I hope you'll join us again on March 24th for supervising and retaining volunteers, which is the third and final webinar in our series. I'll be covering strategies for effective supervision and recognition of volunteers. And recognition, I think, is one of the most enjoyable parts of volunteer engagement or volunteer management. So I'm really looking forward to that. And we'll bring that volunteer engagement cycle sort of full circle, which results in keeping volunteers coming back to partner with you. And we'll include the registration link to the upcoming webinar in that follow-up email tomorrow. So if you haven't registered yet, you'll be able to do that. I know we covered a lot of material very quickly tonight. You know, if you think of questions later on, or if you need assistance with any part of what we've covered tonight, or really any element of volunteer engagement, And if your organization is a Grow and Lead member, remember that membership includes a benefit of 4 hours of consulting time with Grow and Lead staff. So don't hesitate to contact me for a consult. And if your organization is not a Grow and Lead member, you can find out how to become one at glcyd.org/membership. And thanks for attending the webinar tonight. Let's take one quick look, see if any questions have come in. Are you seeing anything, Victoria?
No questions, just attendees saying how wonderful the session was, Linda, and what help this information is for their organization. So thank you so much for presenting tonight.
Well, it's my pleasure. And I look forward to hearing from you. We love to hear from members, non-members. So again, if you do come up with any questions, shoot them our way. And have a good evening, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.